I want you to think about something that may feel uncomfortable right now. Why do people who genuinely believe they are good, end up doing things that contradict their own values? Why do we, at times, betray what we claim to hold sacred? You, me, everyone, we're all susceptible to this. It's not just a question of weakness or ignorance. It's something far deeper. It's something embedded in how we as humans are wired, how society operates, how systems function, and how our own minds deceive us. We tend to believe that being a good person means being consistent in our actions, that morality is a kind of armor that shields us from falling into wrongdoing. But think about this: if morality were that simple, why do we see so many instances of people acting against their own ethical principles? Why do people who genuinely care about others, parents, leaders, activists, sometimes cause harm to those they care about? Why do you, even at your best, sometimes act in ways you later regret? Let's be honest. There's a part of you that has done things you can't fully explain. You've probably rationalized it, told yourself a story to make it seem acceptable, or even convinced yourself it wasn't that bad. But have you ever stopped to ask what's really going on when I act against what I believe? The easy answer is to say it's weakness or selfishness, but that's not the real reason, at least not the whole reason. We live in a world of competing priorities, and every decision we make exists within a web of pressures, some external, some internal. You might think you're acting freely, but are you? How many of the choices you make are influenced by things you don't fully understand, the expectations of others, your own survival needs, the way you've been conditioned to think? Let me give you an example. Imagine someone who deeply values honesty. They see themselves as a truthful person. And yet, when faced with a situation where telling the truth could cost them their job, they lie. Is this person a hypocrite? Sure, you could say that. But is it that simple? If you strip away the judgment, what you're left with is a person caught in a conflict between two forces: their value of honesty and their need for security. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern that plays out in all of us, in different ways all the time.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
So here's the deeper question: why do these conflicts exist in the first place? Why do we live in a world where being true to our values is often at odds with our survival or success? And what does it say about us that we so often choose the latter? If we're being honest, morality is not as straightforward as we like to believe. It's not something you can neatly separate from the circumstances of your life. In fact, morality itself is shaped by those circumstances. The values you hold aren't just yours, they're inherited from the culture you live in, the family you grew up with, the time and place you were born into. And those values often conflict not just with the world around you, but with each other. Take loyalty and justice, for example. On the surface, both seem like noble principles. But what happens when being loyal to someone you care about means covering up an injustice they've committed? Do you betray your sense of justice to protect them, or do you betray them to uphold justice? There's no easy answer, and that's the point. Morality isn't a fixed code, it's a constant negotiation. The problem is, we don't like to admit this. We want to believe that we're consistent, that our values guide us like a compass. But the truth is, our actions are often driven by forces we're not even aware of. And one of the biggest forces is fear. Think about the last time you did something you knew wasn't right. What was driving you? Was it fear of losing something, your job, your reputation, someone's approval? Fear is one of the most powerful motivators in human behavior, and it's often what pushes us to act against our own values. But here's the tricky part: fear doesn't always present itself as fear. Sometimes it disguises itself as practicality, as logic, as doing what needs to be done, and in those moments, we convince ourselves that we're not really betraying our values, we're just being realistic. But are we? Or are we just avoiding the discomfort of facing our own contradictions? This is where things get uncomfortable. Because if you're willing to look closely, you'll see that a lot of what we call morality is actually just self-interest in disguise. We like to think of ourselves as good people, but how much of that goodness is performative? How much of it is about maintaining an image rather than truly living by our principles? And here's the thing, it's not just individuals who face this struggle. It's entire systems. Look at any institution, governments, corporations, even charities, and you'll see the same pattern. These systems are made up of people, and those people are often forced to choose between their values and their survival within the system. A politician who compromises their principles to get re-elected. A business leader who prioritizes profit over ethics to keep their company afloat. These aren't isolated incidents, they're systemic realities. So where does that leave us? Are we doomed to be hypocrites, forever torn between our values and our survival? Or is there a way to bridge the gap? The first step is to acknowledge the complexity of the problem. If you think morality is simple, you'll never understand why people, including yourself, fall short of it. But if you can accept that morality is a negotiation, you can start to approach it with humility. Humility is key here, because one of the biggest obstacles to living by your values is the belief that you're already doing it. When you think you're a good person, you stop questioning your actions. You stop asking whether your choices align with your principles. And that's when you're most vulnerable to doing harm, because you don't see it as harm. So here's a question for you. What would it look like to live with integrity, not as a static state, but as an ongoing process? What would it mean to constantly question your actions, to hold yourself accountable, even when it's uncomfortable? This isn't about beating yourself up or striving for perfection. It's about being honest with yourself, truly honest. And that kind of honesty is rare, because it requires you to face parts of yourself you'd rather avoid. It requires you to admit that you're not as consistent as you'd like to be, that you're influenced by forces you don't fully understand. But here's the paradox: the more you're willing to admit your own contradictions, the more likely you are to act with integrity. Because integrity isn't about never falling short, it's about being willing to see where you fall short and doing the work to course correct. And that work is hard. It requires you to question not just your actions, but the systems and structures you're part of. It requires you to ask how much of what I do is truly my choice, and how much of it is shaped by the pressures around me. This isn't just a personal question, it's a collective one. Because if we want to create a world where good people don't have to do bad things, we need to build systems that don't force them to choose between their values and their survival. But that's easier said than done. Because those systems are built on the same contradictions that exist within each of us. They reflect our fears, our compromises, our unwillingness to face uncomfortable truths. So the question isn't just why do good people do bad things? It's also what kind of world are we creating that makes it so hard for people to live by their values? And what are we willing to do to change that? If you've stayed with me this far, I want you to take a moment to reflect on your own life. Where are the places where your actions don't align with your values? What are the forces, internal or external, that push you to compromise? And what would it take for you to face those forces head on? Not with judgment, but with curiosity and courage. This is where the real work begins. Because understanding why good people do bad things isn't just about understanding others, it's about understanding yourself. And that's the hardest, but most necessary, work of all. Let's push this further. You and I both know that understanding why good people do bad things isn't just an intellectual exercise, this is deeply personal. It's about confronting the messy, imperfect reality of being human. And here's the hard truth: if we don't face these hidden traps within ourselves, we'll keep falling into them. You see, every one of us has blind spots, places in our mind where we don't see clearly. These blind spots are dangerous because they allow us to justify our actions, even when those actions go against what we claim to believe. And the scariest part, we don't even realize we're doing it. Let's talk about one of the most common traps: self-deception. This is when we twist our own perception of reality to protect our ego. Think about the last time you did something that you're not proud of. Maybe you hurt someone, cut a corner, or acted in a way that didn't align with your values. Chances are, you didn't immediately say to yourself, "I'm doing something wrong." Instead, you probably rationalized it. Maybe you told yourself, "It's not that big of a deal," or "I had no other choice," or "I'm doing this for the greater good." These justifications might feel true in the moment, but are they? Or are they just defenses protecting you from the discomfort of admitting you've fallen short? Here's the thing: the human mind is a master storyteller. It's constantly weaving narratives to make sense of the world and to make us feel okay about ourselves. But these narratives aren't always grounded in reality. Often they're skewed by our fears, our desires, and our need to avoid guilt or shame. So let me ask you, how often do you question the stories you tell yourself? How often do you stop and ask, am I being honest with myself right now, or am I just telling myself a story that makes me feel better? This is one of the hardest questions you'll ever face. Because if you're really honest, you'll see that self-deception is everywhere. It's in the little excuses you make, the justifications you cling to, the ways you avoid taking responsibility. And if you don't confront it, it will control you. But self-deception isn't just a personal issue, it's also a social one. We don't live in isolation, we're part of a collective. And within that collective, there are shared stories, cultural narratives that shape how we see the world. These narratives can be just as deceptive as the ones we tell ourselves. Think about some of the dominant stories in our culture. Stories about success, power, and what it means to be a good person. These stories often create impossible standards that force us to compromise our values just to survive. For example, think about the narrative of individual success. We're told that if we work hard enough, we can achieve anything. But what happens when success comes at the expense of others? What happens when achieving your goals requires stepping on someone else's dignity or well-being? This isn't just hypothetical, it's a reality for many people. Look at the corporate world, where climbing the ladder often means playing politics, cutting corners, or prioritizing profit over ethics. Look at the political sphere, where maintaining power often requires compromising principles. Look at your own life and the decisions you've made to get ahead. The truth is, we're all influenced by these cultural narratives, whether we realize it or not. And if we don't question them, they'll lead us down paths that conflict with our values. But questioning them isn't easy, because these narratives aren't just external, they're internalized. They're part of how we see ourselves and the world. Challenging them means challenging your own identity, your own assumptions, your own sense of what's possible. So here's the question: what are the narratives you've internalized? What are the stories you've been taught about what matters, about who you're supposed to be, about what it means to live a good life? And how many of those stories are leading you away from your values rather than toward them? There's another trap we need to talk about, and it's one that's deeply tied to human nature: tribalism. As social creatures, we have an innate need to belong. We want to feel connected to others, to be part of something bigger than ourselves. And that's not inherently bad. Community is essential to our well-being. But tribalism can also be dangerous. Because when your need to belong becomes more important than your values, you're at risk of betraying those values to stay in the group. Think about it. How often do people go along with something they know is wrong because they don't want to rock the boat? How often do we silence our own conscience to avoid conflict, rejection, or judgment? This happens everywhere in families, in workplaces, in communities, in politics. And it's not just about fear of exclusion, it's also about identity. When you tie your identity to a group, it becomes much harder to question that group's actions, because questioning them feels like questioning yourself. But here's the danger: when you prioritize belonging over integrity, you become complicit in whatever the group does, even if it goes against your values. And the scariest part, you might not even realize it's happening. So let me ask you, where in your life are you compromising your values to fit in? What are the loyalties that keep you silent, that keep you from acting on what you know is right? And what would it take for you to break free from those loyalties, even if it means standing alone? I know these questions are uncomfortable, but that's the point. Growth doesn't happen in comfort. It happens when you're willing to face the hard truths about yourself and the world. Here's another trap that's worth examining: the normalization of harm. This is when something harmful becomes so common that we stop seeing it as harmful. It's when injustice becomes part of the status quo, and we accept it because that's just the way things are. Think about the systems we live in: economic systems, political systems, social systems. How many of these systems are built on harm? How many of them prioritize profit over well-being, power over justice, convenience over sustainability? And yet, we participate in these systems every day. We buy products made under exploitative conditions. We support industries that harm the environment. We vote for leaders who perpetuate inequality. And most of the time, we don't even think about it. Why? Because it's normal. It's what everyone else is doing. And when something is normal, it's easy to ignore its moral implications. But here's the thing: just because something is normal doesn't mean it's right. In fact, some of the greatest moral failures in history have been normalized by the societies in which they occurred. Slavery was normal. Segregation was normal. Exploitation, oppression, and systemic violence have all been normalized at different points in history. So here's the question: what are the harms we've normalized today? What are the injustices we accept because they're part of the status quo? And how are we complicit in perpetuating them? This isn't an easy question to answer, because when you start to see the harm that's been normalized, you also start to see your own role in it. And that's uncomfortable. But it's also necessary, because if we don't face these truths, nothing will change. If we keep deceiving ourselves, if we keep prioritizing belonging over integrity, if we keep accepting harm as normal, we'll keep betraying our values. And the world will keep being shaped by that betrayal. So what's the way forward? How do we break free from these traps? It starts with awareness. You can't change what you don't see. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. But awareness isn't enough. It has to lead to action. And that action starts with you. Not with waiting for others to change, not with blaming the system, but with taking responsibility for your own choices. So here's the challenge: what are the choices you can make right now to align your actions with your values? What are the risks you're willing to take to live with integrity, even if it costs you something? This is the work of a lifetime. It's not easy, and it's not comfortable. But it's necessary. Because the world doesn't change when we wait for others to do the right thing. It changes when we decide to do the right thing, even when it's hard. Let's bring this all together. We've uncovered the hidden traps: self-deception, cultural narratives, tribalism, the normalization of harm. We've asked hard questions about why good people, like you and me, sometimes do things that betray our deepest values. But now comes the most important part. What do we do with this understanding? How do we live with integrity in a world that constantly pressures us to compromise it? Let me be clear, there's no perfect answer. Integrity is not a destination you arrive at, it's a way of being that requires constant effort. It's messy, it's uncomfortable, and it's often inconvenient. But the alternative, living a life of quiet contradictions, is far more costly. Because every time we betray our values, we lose a little piece of ourselves. The first step is radical honesty. Not just honesty with others, but honesty with yourself. And let's not sugarcoat this, it's hard. It's hard to admit when you've fallen short, when you've been hypocritical, when you've rationalized actions that don't align with your principles. But without this honesty, there's no way forward. So let me ask you, what are the stories you've been telling yourself to justify your actions? What are the parts of yourself you've been avoiding because they make you uncomfortable? And are you willing to face them, even if it means confronting painful truths about who you are and how you've been living? Here's the thing about honesty, it's not a one-time event. It's a practice. It's something you have to commit to every day, in every decision, in every interaction. And it's not just about admitting when you're wrong. It's about questioning your motives before you act. It's about asking yourself, am I doing this because it's right, or because it's easy? Because it aligns with my values, or because it serves my ego? This kind of honesty requires something most of us avoid: stillness. In a world that's constantly pulling at your attention, that's always demanding more, faster, louder, it's hard to find the space to reflect. But without reflection, you're just reacting, running on autopilot, driven by forces you don't fully understand. So ask yourself, when was the last time you truly sat with yourself and examined your choices, not superficially, but deeply? When was the last time you stopped and asked, am I living in alignment with who I want to be? And if the answer is no, what are you willing to do about it? The second step is courage, because honesty without action is hollow. It's not enough to see where you've gone astray, you have to be willing to course correct. And that takes courage. Courage to admit when you're wrong. Courage to have difficult conversations. Courage to stand up for what you believe in, even when it costs you something. Courage to walk away from situations, relationships, or systems that demand you compromise your values. And let's not romanticize this courage as hard. It's uncomfortable. It might mean losing friends, opportunities, security. It might mean being misunderstood, judged, or rejected. But here's the truth: integrity always comes with a price. The question is, are you willing to pay it? Here's a deeper question: what's the cost of not paying it? What does it do to your soul, to your sense of self, to your relationships when you consistently choose what's easy over what's right? How much of yourself are you willing to lose to avoid the discomfort of living with integrity? The third step is humility. Because no matter how hard you try, you're going to fall short. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to act out of fear or ego or ignorance. That's inevitable. But what matters is how you respond when that happens. Humility means being willing to acknowledge your failures without letting them define you. It means being open to feedback, even when it stings. It means recognizing that integrity isn't about being perfect, it's about being willing to try again and again, no matter how many times you fall. And here's the paradox: the more humble you are, the stronger your integrity becomes. Because humility allows you to see yourself clearly, to own your mistakes, and to grow from them. And that's what integrity is: a commitment to growth, to becoming a little better, a little more aligned every day. But here's the hard truth: none of this can happen in isolation. Integrity isn't just a personal practice, it's a collective one. Because we don't live in a vacuum, we're part of systems, communities, relationships. And if those systems and communities are built on compromise and harm, it's almost impossible to live with integrity within them. So the question isn't just, how do I live with integrity? It's also, how do we create a world where living with integrity is possible? This is where the work becomes bigger than yourself. It's not enough to align your own actions with your values. You have to challenge the systems that force others to compromise theirs. You have to ask, what are the structures, the norms, the incentives that make it so hard for people to do the right thing? And what can we do to change them? This isn't easy work. It's systemic, it's complex, and it's slow. But it starts with small actions. It starts with the choices you make every day, what you consume, where you work, how you vote, how you show up in your relationships. It starts with speaking up when you see harm, even if it's uncomfortable. It starts with building communities that prioritize values over convenience, justice over comfort. And here's the truth, you're not going to fix the world overnight. But that doesn't mean your efforts don't matter. Every action you take, every choice you make, sends a ripple outward, and those ripples add up. So the final question is this: what kind of ripples are you creating? Are your actions contributing to a world where integrity is possible, or are they reinforcing the very systems that undermine it? This is the challenge of being human. To live in a world full of contradictions, full of pressures and compromises, and still strive to be true to your values. To face your own flaws, your own blind spots, your own complicity, and still choose to do the work. And here's the hope: the more of us who take on this challenge, the more we create a culture of integrity. The more we normalize honesty, courage, and humility. The more we build systems that support, rather than undermine, our values. So I'll leave you with this: integrity isn't something you have, it's something you do. It's a daily practice, a continual commitment, a choice you make again and again. And in a world that often pushes you to compromise, choosing integrity is one of the most radical, transformative things you can do. It won't be easy, but it will be worth it. Because in the end, the measure of your life isn't how comfortable it was, or how successful you were by society's standards. The measure of your life is whether you lived in alignment with what you truly believe, whether you had the courage to stand for what matters, even when it was hard. So what will you choose? Will you take the easy road, the one paved with compromises and justifications? Or will you take the harder path, the path of honesty, courage, and humility? The path of integrity? That choice is yours. It always has been.